Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. Stay tuned until the end for a special offer. Hi everyone, and thank you so much for watching this week's painting time lapse, and it's going to showcase a watercolor brush pen tutorial of this little bird painting. I must be suffering from a severe case of quarantine brain because I actually filmed this video last year and for some reason forgot to sort through my footage and post it until now. So I'm very sorry for the delay, but better late than never. So if you're like me and relatively new to watercolor brush pens, I'll give you a quick rundown of what they are and how they're different from watercolors traditionally. Watercolors, traditionally you have an empty brush that you wet with water and then you pick up watercolor pigment, whether it's from a dry palette or from liquid watercolor that you squeeze out of tubes, and then you deposit that pigment onto your paper. Watercolor brush pens are similar in that sense that you use water to dilute the pigment and you paint on the same type of paper. However, as you can see on the screen here, watercolor brush pens themselves are free of water. They're very highly pigmented, almost kind of like a marker. And then you use a separate kind of empty cartridge brush that has water stored in the stem, and you can press down on the stem to slowly deposit water onto the paper. So you almost have one tool for depositing pigment and one tool for blending it, diluting it, spreading it. To be honest, I actually prefer traditional watercolors. This isn't super intuitive to me, and maybe it's just because I need a little bit more practice with the medium, but it was kind of a lot more mental load to just have to switch between the two tools instead of just having one brush and worrying about how much pigment or how much water is on the one brush, having to constantly switch back between a very highly pigmented watercolor brush marker and then switch to the kind of empty, completely clear water cartridge pen. It was very strange. Anyways, more on that later. Let's actually get the demo started. The first step is preparing my watercolor paper. This might seem a little bit like a hack, but it's been very useful for me in the past, so I'll share this with you. I trace a 5x7-inch gesso board panel onto a piece of watercolor paper that's slightly larger. I think I cut the watercolor paper to be about 6x8. So there's a little bit of a border around my painting area, and I use that space to secure my masking tape. By taping all four edges of the paper onto my table, it not only provides a very stable and non-slip piece of paper to paint on, but it also helps prevent the paper from warping too much, because when you wet the watercolor paper, it tends to kind of have a mind of its own and it starts warping and changing shape. So by securing all four edges onto the table, it helps alleviate some of that warping that you can see during the painting process. And now we begin the actual painting. The first part is, of course, the underdrawing. I am just very loosely and lightly sketching out an outline of where I want everything to be, making sure that the composition looks correct. I'm actually using just a regular mechanical pencil that I normally use for drawing black and white graphite drawings, but inside the pencil is a piece of red erasable lead. I think it's a 0.7 millimeter size. This is super convenient because, as you all know, I love doing my under drawings and sketching in red first, especially if I'll be laying a water-based medium on top of it. Red just interacts so much better with these colorful water-based pigments. And having just this red erasable lead in a mechanical pencil saves me a little bit of time, so I don't have to continuously sharpen a regular colored pencil. As usual, I will have all of my art supplies listed in the video description if you're ever interested in trying out any of these for yourself. So now it's time to actually start laying down some color. And as I mentioned before, I'm not super familiar with this particular type of medium yet. So I tended to work very carefully, making sure to tackle section by section. And one of the main struggles I discovered earlier on, especially when compared to the traditional watercolor medium, is that these brush pens don't really give you as much control over thinner, more transparent washes. So if you want your color to be applied in a very light and subtle way, it takes a bit more finesse. You know, with regular watercolors, you can just make sure that there's a lot more water on your brush when compared to the amount of pigment on your brush, and you can load your brush up with pigment, kind of dip it in your water, dry it out, and then you have this very faded light application. But with this, because you can't really control the density or the saturation of the colors coming out of the brush markers themselves, what I ended up having to do was just apply a little bit of the brush marker onto the paper and very quickly go in with the wet cartridge blending pen and making sure that I kind of wipe and spread that color as fast as possible before the paper can absorb all of it. So it did pose some challenges for me in that sense. So in some ways, I'm glad that I chose a reference photo of a bird that was already very colorful in nature, because then it wasn't as obvious. But yeah, it definitely requires a lot of being quick on your feet and kind of trying to outrun the timer, because the paper does absorb the watercolor brush pens very quickly. Since there's not a lot of water in them, the time frame to actually work with them and spread them is very small. However, one thing that I did love about this medium when compared to traditional watercolors is that because the brush pens themselves are not as wet, you are able to more easily paint these kind of elegant lines and detail work. For example, here on the branches, or when I'm painting the little berries, or even the individual hairs on the bird. As long as the color I'm using is dark, like the berries are very saturated and red, and the tree branch is a dark brown, so I don't really have to worry about making those parts faded and light. So they do give me a lot of control, and I don't have to re-wet my brush as much. In traditional watercolor mediums, if I want to paint a lot of thin detailed line work, it's not long before my brush kind of runs out of pigment and I have to reload it. And sometimes for me, it's challenging to reload it because the watercolor on my palette has dried, and having to kind of remix it to the same degree of saturation is difficult. Because usually with watercolors, traditionally the more pigment you have and the more saturated it is, the less water you can use, because you want to give the pigments more chance to shine. So you end up with kind of like a very dry application, and it's tough to get smooth, thin lines. So with the brush pens, there's definitely pros and cons depending on the exact subject matter that you're painting or what effect you're going for. There are certain strengths that are better with brush pens, and of course certain flaws that are a little bit more challenging. But overall, it was a super fun experience. It kind of felt like a mixture of drawing and painting. It almost felt like I was using just brush markers and doing like a dry medium illustration, but with some of the magic and unpredictability of watercolors. And of course, the end result looks very watercolory. So I think for if you're on the go and you don't want to bring like a whole watercolor palette or setup with you, if you're traveling or just want an easier kind of lighter setup, this could be a great option. And like with any other medium, I'm sure with more practice and more familiarity, it will get easier and you'll be able to unlock more of the advantages versus struggling to ramp up and learn how to cope with the disadvantages. And that about wraps up today's review/tutorial. I hope that this video was useful and gave you some insight into watercolor brush pens. If you like to adopt this cute little bird painting, I do have her listed in my shop at happyd-artist.com. Also, since it looks like quarantine isn't ending anytime soon, I decided why not keep extending my spring sale into June. So if you want 20% off of your order of anything from my shop, including originals, just enter the code SPRING at happyd-artist.com, and the sale will end June 30th. And if you're interested in learning more about how to paint and draw, I have lots of art educational content on my Patreon page, including exclusive video tutorials, step-by-step photo tutorials, live streams, podcasts, and even surprise art gift boxes. All available at patreon.com/happydartist. I'd love to have you join my Patreon family. I wanted to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video and for supporting my channel and the art community. I've actually enjoyed using Squarespace for 4 years now to build and host my online shop and website. So whether you need a domain, website, or online store, Make your next move with Squarespace. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and visit squarespace.com/happydartist for 10% off your first purchase. Also, if you want to check out more artworks, works in progress, and just random daily artist adventures, feel free to check out my Instagram, and you can follow me at the handle @happydartist.